Who introduces me? Let me know you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We are very, very pleased and delighted to have Dr. Allison Hamilton with us today for our monthly methods seminar. Dr. Hamilton is a BA research scientist at the Implementation Research Director at the VA Center for the Study of Healthcare Innovation, Implementation, and Policy at the Greater Los Angeles Healthcare System, and also a professor in residence in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at UCLA. Her research focuses on improving health services for vulnerable populations through evidence-based practices and implementation science. She leads multiple VA and NIH-funded initiatives and serves on several editorial boards, including implementation science and women's health issues. Dr. Hamilton will be talking about survey development in the concepts of CBPR and using qualitative methods. And I also have to say, Dr. Hamilton is a trainer and teacher extraordinaire. I know she has helped so much, giving trainings on Atlas TI, doing qualitative research, qualitative methods. I've learned so much from her, and I'm so happy to be able to introduce her. And without further ado, Dr. Hamilton.
Wow, well, thank you so much. That was a very, very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. You made me think I should have probably included a couple more resources, but we can add them in later. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk about this topic, which isn't, one of my usual topics necessarily. But then as I was preparing it, I thought, oh, I guess there's some really interesting examples to talk about across a couple of different initiatives. So it was really fun to put it together. And I purposely didn't make it too lengthy so that we can really talk through any questions and ideas and comments you all have. So there's ideas to share with you, resources to share with you. But I'm really interested in, where everyone in this group is coming from in terms of these questions of designing surveys using CBPR. So really hope that we can be very interactive and learn from each other. So thank you again for having me and giving me a chance to think about these things. So I just want to start, as I often want to, think about what is the problem that we're really trying to address. Let me just do a little screen management here. Of course, when we're thinking about using surveys, we potentially are going to misfire with questions if the questions are not particularly designed for the populations where the survey will be used. And so this idea that, if we use a pre-existing instrument, we may overlook many things. We may overlook meanings, we may overlook concepts, we may overlook norms, and we may then make assumptions that are really not valid to make. And that could contribute to data that are less than accurate, less than comprehensive, and less than helpful for, whatever issues, research questions we may have. And so the idea of designing surveys from a community-based approach and with community engagement as sort of the foundation is definitely one direction that we can take to have better instruments, have better measures, and make sure that those measures are really relevant and appropriate for the populations that we're interested in. There's surprisingly little out there available about how to use community participation to develop and conduct population-based surveys. And in fact, several of the resources that I found were in books, and they may not be books that we're necessarily checking out, not necessarily on our radar. And when my colleagues and I wrote the Milbank Quarterly paper that I think you all have read, I mean, we were looking far and wide for measures of community engagement, and many of them were not, in journals. And so I really keep seeing over and over again that there just isn't a lot of accessible information about a more community engaged approach to developing surveys or adapting surveys, which is interesting. because, I think there's that counteracting force that says, well, we have designed this survey in a very careful way, and we've, checked all of our psychometrics, and we've used all of our procedures to ensure that the instrument is valid. And so we have sort of that very heavy research paradigm around how we develop surveys. But then often we learn that once we use them outside of the population for which they were originally designed, they don't necessarily capture things accurately and appropriately. And that if we can bring community-based participatory research and community-engaged paradigms into this work, we may actually do a better job of asking the right questions in the right way. So that's really where I, kind of took this from to develop this brief set of slides for us today. And I wanted to bring in a couple of really very different examples for you. And then again, really curious to hear what you all are thinking about in relation to this topic. So of course, when we're developing surveys with community-based participatory research as a driving principle, we're thinking about balancing our interests as researchers and the interests of the community where we want to do our work. And are we thinking about more of a community-driven than a research-driven process? Vice versa? Have we maybe approached things from a research-driven place and realized that we need to be more community-driven? But it's a really key question to ask ourselves as we're moving in this direction of survey development, which is whose lens are we using? What principles are we using? How much do we know about those principles, especially if we are not from and of the community where we're doing our work? And one of the key questions that's really come up in my read of the literature and in my own experience of doing this type of work is getting at who are we asking for what, and when are we asking them for it, and how are we asking them for it? And this is not only limited to survey development. This really has a lot to do with community-based participatory research in general. When are we asking people? What are we asking them for? And very importantly, how are we asking them for it? Because we know that how we ask for input has a lot to do with whether we're successful at getting that input and getting the input that is really true to people's experiences and perspectives and priorities and ways of thinking about, what they want the research to reflect and what they don't want it to reflect. And I think many of you know I'm an anthropologist, so we, are kind of trained to think about things in this way. And then when we put it in more of the health services or implementation research context, we may be thinking about groups, communities, so forth, in a variety of different ways. And so I'm going to bring in a couple of maybe a bit off the wall examples just to expand the way that we think about this, or at least that is my goal. So throughout the process of designing surveys, planning surveys, there are some key foundations for success. And I think one of the most important things that I've learned, that I've seen, is that, when we are trying to improve our measurement efforts, we need to do so in a dialogue, and in a dialogue that happens early and often, and not going to people and communities, community members, different constituents at a point where their input and their engagement really won't even have an impact on what we do, because they will know that they are actually just being asked as sort of a pro forma, or they're being asked because the researcher, the team feels like they have to ask, and so they go in, and it's a little too late to even have that meaningful input. And so if we're going to try to develop surveys, measures, et cetera, in a more community engaged way, that the timeline and the time frame for that needs to start very, very early, and at a point where really nothing has been set up. Maybe the topics, because obviously you need to know which communities you're going to, who you're going to be asking, again, that critical question. But within those sort of broad topical or subject matter parameters, that you're still very open to figuring this out together. And it may be that what you're providing as a researcher is a sense of here's what's been measured and how it's been measured to date, and here are the problems that we found with that. So you can certainly bring your research knowledge and your experience to bear on those early dialogues, but it's just providing that context for why you're there, why you're asking for the engagement of a particular community, what you're hoping to gain from this interaction and this very bidirectional process. And it's also not a one-time thing. Um, if you're meaningfully engaging communities, it means that you're continuing that engagement throughout the life of the project. So not just going in the beginning saying, can we get your feedback or input on how we ask certain questions about certain things, but that it's a relationship that you're building. And if we go in once or twice and kind of get what we need and leave, it will not speak well of us as researchers. It will not typically bode well for the research. We really need to ensure that if it's truly community engaged, that this is something that you're investing in, and that you're investing in for the life of the project and hopefully beyond. So that means engaging community in interpretation of what you learn from collecting the data, translation of your findings into potentially policy and practice, dissemination efforts. Those community members or different community organizations and groups can be absolutely invaluable in making sure that what was learned makes it into the hands of people who would be interested. So it's more looking toward a very long-term relationship, should all go well, and that there will be engagement throughout that entire process. And then it does involve a negotiation. I mean, even though we are going in to community-based participatory research as researchers and have our agendas and are engaged in this work for our own particular purposes, from a community-based perspective, negotiation is at the heart of what we're doing. It's not saying that, what I want to do is the most important thing, or the way that I want to carry this out is the way it's going to happen. It's more sharing of ideas and coming together, potentially privileging what community members say in terms of how things should be done, rather than sticking to the way that you think things should be done. If, again, community engagement is really your goal. And that has everything to do with designing our measures and our instruments as well, because we we want to be sure that the way that we're going about conducting the research is in keeping with the priorities and principles of the community that has the expertise we're interested in. I really like this idea that, going back to what I was saying before about relationships and kind of thinking about what you're establishing, there is an idea in the literature that you want to leave something behind, that you're not going in empty-handed and that you're not leaving without having given something to the community where you were doing your work, where you were engaged, if you are indeed leaving at all. But this means that capacity building, equipping people with new knowledge, new skills, new tools, whatever shape, form that might take, it means that you're providing something of service that they have shared with you would be of interest to them. And that really helps with that future and the sustainability of these relationships, or at least the impressions that last for a long time, even if you aren't going to be in a, decade-long relationship with a particular community partner for whatever reasons, that you have left valuable skills, training, capacities, resources in place for the future, because that helps even with people you don't know, who may want to do community engaged research in those communities in the future, that what you've done really put a positive and favorable spin on what research looks like and what engagement looks like. It's also critical, as with any effort, any collaborative effort, that we have structures. I don't know how many of you have actually designed surveys. I had not really designed surveys before a project that I'm going to tell you about in a few minutes, and I did not know how hard it was. I was well versed in my qualitative methods, mixed methods, and then when I realized what it took to design a survey, that was a very eye-opening experience. And given the detailed nature of this type of work, having structures in place for the different components of survey development is absolutely essential. We need that organization. We need to know who is responsible for what. It may be that multiple substructures are necessary for different components of the survey that may be related to, different areas of expertise, availability, et cetera. And we'll get into some lessons learned from this type of work a little bit later in terms of different structures. In one kind of early example of using community-based participatory research approaches to survey design, this was for the design of the Healthy Environments Partnership Survey. What they had as a structure for their approach was a steering committee that really drove the design of the survey, and they conducted multiple focus groups with community members to help think through what the survey would look like, use those findings to bring to a survey subcommittee. So there was a subcommittee within the steering committee that took the focus group findings and divided those up across different domains or subscales of the survey that they were developing. And then they assigned different members different topics depending on their interests, their areas of expertise, et cetera. And they had a process, a very structured process for pre-testing and discussing the survey with community members. And as you'll see in a moment when I talk about adaptation and translation, there are so many components of surveys that we need to think about and look at in terms of whether they make sense fundamentally, not only language, but also meaning, flow, the ways in which and the order in which we're asking questions, the comprehensiveness. Are we covering all of the topics that need to be covered? Is there something missing from, the way that we're asking about this that people might say, but you didn't even talk to me about such and such, and kind of missed a whole dimension of this particular phenomenon. We want to look at things like clarity of the items and the language that we're using and interpretability. So do we know that the way that people are answering the questions actually relates to what our intentions were with the questions? So many, many different aspects of each item, of each subscale, of the collection of subscales, of the overall flow, burden, design of the survey. Are we asking, the sets of questions in logical ways? Are we asking them in ways that people feel comfortable and don't feel too overwhelmed with the detailed nature of the questions? And again, are they understanding what we're trying to ask about? And so that involves typically quite a bit of pre-testing and discussion and multiple iterations of those conversations as the survey takes more and more shape towards something that looks like it is reflective of community input and perspectives. So to give you a different example, this is the one where I started to think, this is where I thought this designing of surveys is very difficult. And I started thinking, community can mean a lot of different things. We have sort of an idea of what community is, like a community that's out there that we go to, that's a neighborhood or maybe a different cultural setting, whatever it might be. But we can really think about community in very, very broad ways. And it's, a collection of people who may share certain characteristics along many different lines, geographic characteristics, identity related characteristics, training related characteristics, et cetera. And so I was really contemplating as I was preparing for today, my experience of designing a survey using qualitative methods. In the space of genetic medicine, where I do not have expertise, we were doing a series of projects with a clinical geneticist, Dr. Maureen Schooner, and I'm just going to tell you a little story about this. Because we actually were going to field a survey, a national survey, and maybe do some qualitative work on the side. And I was the sort of qualitative person in this project. And this was several years ago, and maybe about 10, 12 years ago. Yeah, or maybe even longer. And the idea at the time, she was fairly new to VA at the time, but we were looking at implementation of genetic services in VA. And by genetic services, that was really two main things. One, using genetic tests, and two, having genetic counselors available and doing genetic counseling. And so coming from her background as, a leading expert probably in the world on this topic, she had certain assumptions about what would be going on in the VA integrated healthcare system. There must be a lot going on in the VA in relation to genetic services. And so let's field a survey, find out what's going on. How can we increase adoption and implementation of genetic services, kind of jump from what must already be going on to let's move to implementation. And we started to do interviews and quickly realized, she, to her dismay, realized that there was not nearly as much going on as she thought would or should or could be going on in the VA. And she's told this story. I don't think I'm sharing anything she wouldn't want me to share. But when we started to interview people in different specialties, basically what we were hearing was, yeah, I don't use genetic services. I don't order genetic tests. I don't know if we have a genetic counselor. This is across multiple sites. And so we realized that if we just went and administered a survey to the best of her knowledge, we would be very uninformed, misinformed, and not asking questions that needed to be asked to really get much more of a baseline sense of what is going on in this area of clinical genetic services. So we ended up doing much more qualitative work than she had originally anticipated. We had a wonderful expert panel guiding us through this process and many processes, and she was very open to doing more intensive qualitative work than she had expected to do. So we ended up doing many interviews. I think it was probably about 50, 55 or 60 interviews across 5 different clinical specialties where either we surmised that there would be some use of clinical genetic services like in neurology and oncology, but also we're curious about the use of these services, for example, in primary care. So we did all these interviews. I did them, and she was present for most of them because there were just technical aspects of this that I couldn't possibly follow up on. But she of course knew the name of all the relevant tests and many different specialized knowledge areas that she would bring to bear on the interviews. And then we took the results of our interviews and design the survey based on those results. And that is the part that was incredibly hard and painstaking, thinking about all the things I mentioned before. What types of questions are we asking? What subscales should there be? One of the things, for example, that we learned in the interviews was that one of the big barriers, besides lack of knowledge and comfort with clinical genetic services, was this idea that whether it was the right idea or not, but this idea that if if the genetic tests, for example, were not going to change the course of treatment, why would I, as a provider, order the test? If it's not going to change what I do, why am I going to get the test that I may or may not even understand in some specialties? And so this idea of clinical utility was something that we didn't totally anticipate and decided we could bring that into the survey. We probably wouldn't have even brought it into the survey had we not learned from the qualitative interviews that this was a really key barrier or sort of perception that was going to be affecting implementation. And so we took, every finding from every specialty and figured out what the overall prototype of the survey would look like. We developed 5 customized versions of the survey. So while the subscales, et cetera, were all the same across the 5 specialties, certain genetic tests and real specialized pieces of it were tailored to each specialty. There was one for pathologists as well. So of course, we're going to ask pathologists different questions. And then we did extensive cognitive pre-testing with the survey and had to review, content, language, ease of use. We had national experts review the survey with us. So it went through, again, multiple rounds of fielding, pre-testing, making sure that all those things I mentioned before, meaning, comprehensiveness, accuracy of language, relevance, what measurement scales we were using. Is it importance that we're looking at? Is it comfort, confidence, efficacy? So we even really had to think carefully about what we were measuring in relation to the items. And so we describe that to some extent in the paper cited below, but our whole process really was one of, doing this qualitative work, having expert panels weigh in a mixed methods approach to our overall initiative, fielding the survey, and then we did some additional analysis in that lower left paper on just that issue of clinical utility. And even though this might not be sort of a classic definition of community, I think that I hope that you find it interesting in terms of thinking about what community-based survey development might mean. It might not be a one notion of what a community is, but rather, really thinking about how are we measuring things in different communities, like in this case, specialist communities, and clinicians, where we really wanted to learn in an appropriate and relevant way about their use of these particular services. I am not paying attention to the chat. I don't know if I should be. I was gonna kind of keep going. Okay, is there anything in the chat that I need to know? Okay, good.
Not yet.
I saw some things and I was like, maybe I'm missing a lot of questions, but so far I don't think so. But I won't take too much longer and then we can talk for the remaining time that we have. So that's one perhaps not as traditional of a way of thinking about community-based participatory research, but it really was in the way that we did it. It was just a different way of thinking about community, and brought up all the issues that have come up in other CBPR approaches to survey development, but just kind of turned things in a slightly different way because we were doing it within the specialist community. And the other realm that I wanted to share with you, where I've been doing some of this thinking, is in the revision of existing measures. So, we think about how do we design measures to begin with, but oftentimes we are actually more in the situation of adapting measures that exist and perhaps doing so in a CBPR manner. So realizing that, we may have a body of measures that we want to use, but they aren't appropriate for one reason or many reasons. Often cross-culturally is where we see this, and that may be cross-culturally in the US, it may be cross-culturally with other countries, with other communities in other countries. So certainly not limited to international work, but within our, highly diverse country, just thinking about adaptation that may be necessary for measures that are considered to be standard in certain areas. So we've had, my team has had the good fortune of being funded by the Fogarty Institute at NIH to work on sort of a supplement to a training grant that we have, where we're working on an integrated measures bank. So we're figuring out what in the mental health space. And so we're figuring out what mental health measures have been used, and this is in South Africa. What measures have been used in South Africa? How have they been used? How have they been adapted? And we're building a bank of measures that have been adapted for use in South Africa. And anyone who's not familiar with South Africa, there are 11 official languages. I mean, it is highly, highly diverse in so many ways. And, clearly there are many, many limitations of using Western derived measures among different communities in South Africa and many other places as well. And so I think that the adaptation of measures cross-culturally needs to basically be inherently community engaged. We can't, we are not from those communities, and perhaps even our colleagues are not from the communities where they're doing work in that particular cultural setting. Engagement of those communities in the adaptation of the measures is essential. And again, we're not talking just about translation. That is definitely going to be part of it, typically. It's not just, translating from one language to another, but it's adapting and validating instruments within a particular cultural context. And while there's a decent amount of literature out there on this, it is not as much as we might think, and there's probably not as much as we need. So there are many different dimensions of translating, adapting, and validating. Again, not only changing measures from the source language to the target language, but also thinking about accuracy, fluency, conceptual equivalence, and cultural relevance. Thinking about differences between the source culture and the target culture, where you're going to be using the instruments. And we want to make sure that what we're measuring using an instrument that's been adapted has the same properties as the original instrument. So it becomes very complex very quickly. And we can't do it without community engagement. If we do this in an appropriate way, and there is this wonderful paper that just came out recently about translation, cross-cultural adaptation and validation, practical guideline. It's cited down there. It came out just under a year ago. It's very, very thorough, very, very recent. So it really brings in so much of the thinking that's been done in this area. And, they make the case, and I completely have seen this as we're building this measures bank where, if we do properly adapt measures and test them properly, they will be more reliable, they will be more valid, they will allow for us to do cross-cultural comparisons, and we can do a better job of developing effective interventions if our measurement is more appropriate and relevant. It is not a quick process, and it's not an inexpensive process, but to do it accurately and correctly, which is so important to address, pressing public health issues, we need to engage in it. And there isn't a whole lot of consensus on how it should be done. So just to walk you through a couple of examples where, they kind of bring to light some of these different issues. So this particular example brings up the issue of the complexity of adaptation. The authors were using a measure, a battery of measures for in mental health, and they had two steps. First, figuring out which instruments to use, what the psychometric properties of those instruments were, and then trying to ensure cultural equivalence through a variety of techniques, back translation, decentering one of the versions, using bilingual interpreters, translators, having a committee. And just take, for example, one measure, the life event checklist. Many of you might be familiar with that. And the concept of trauma, it was not familiar to the group with the English term trauma when used in the context of emotions, because trauma was considered to be more an issue of physical damage rather than trauma the way we think about it in terms of PTSD, et cetera. And so the word in the measure was changed to terrible things that can happen to you in both the English and COSA versions. This is just one example of the changes that they needed to think about and make in order to achieve that cultural equivalence and to be asking about the phenomenon that was of interest and not asking about something that people were interpreting in a very different way. And what they found in this process was that power, language, and status were very, very central to what they were trying to do, because there were these fundamental questions about who was really qualified to make decisions to speak for this entire community, and a lot of tension between different language statuses, like who was using which forms of the language. And that was a really big concern in the translation process. So something really to think about, like who is responsible for the translation and adaptation process, and what, kind of worldview do they come from, and what is their status, their level of power in relation to the community. They may be, ideally they would be a member of that community, but at what status and level of the community would be something to pay really careful attention to. In another example that really brought up how adaptation needs to happen at many different levels, they were translating and adapting cognitive tests from the NIH toolbox, and they were focusing on measures that test attention, cognitive flexibility, working memory, episodic memory, processing speed. And so the little diagram on the left shows all of the processes that they went through. And you can see they went through multiple cycles of some of these processes. So the forward and back translation was not a one-time thing. It was 3 cycles of that. Then cognitive interviews, then a workshop, then more revised translation, 3 cycles again of forward and backward translation, building a preliminary version, fine-tuning it, translating it again, having people, take the measures, and then additional translations. So a very, very involved process. And one of the examples they give in the paper is on how even just the images that are being used need to be culturally relevant and appropriate. If people who are taking these cognitive tests wouldn't recognize a bear, we need to change that to an animal that they would recognize. So thinking about all the different levels of something like cognitive tests and making the necessary adjustments at multiple levels to, make it much more relevant and appropriate to a given population. And finally, in this example, they were adapting the adult ADHD self-report scale and show how adaptation, even with careful processes, doesn't always work as planned. So this is really important when we think about using CBPR to develop our surveys and our measures, is that it's not a perfect process, and sometimes we're not even going to end up with a usable measure. As hard as that is to swallow, that might happen. So what they show here, after multiple attempts to adapt this measure, you can see that there are a few, different types of errors. For example, an omission error. So the original item was, how often are you distracted by activity or noise around you? The back translated version was, how many times do you get distracted by nearby events or crowds? An incomplete interpretation, from how often do you waste or mismanage time to how many times do you waste time on trivial things. Like, they sound, potentially sort of in the same ballpark, but when we really think about meaning and then what are we going to do in relation to what we think we're learning from these items and from this measure, is it really the same? Is it similar enough? Something like, how often do you have difficulty unwinding and relaxing when you have time to yourself? Back translated version, again, so forward, backwards translation came out to, how many times do you experience difficulties in relaxing or stretching when you have the opportunity? And they ultimately figured out and decided that they did not sufficiently come up with a usable version of this scale. And so what that might mean, I don't remember if they even addressed in this paper what it meant for them, but what it might mean, if we're doing this type of work in whatever communities, wherever we might be doing it, is that maybe a new measure needs to be designed. Maybe we need to even think about whether we can assess something like ADHD in a very different cultural context, if it's even an appropriate diagnosis to be thinking about in that context. So it brings up a lot of other issues. But just for me, thinking about the cross-cultural dimension of this type of work and the necessity for community engagement to do it, just brings up how complex it is and how much work needs to go into this effort to tailor, adapt, or potentially design entirely new measures, which, have their strengths and weaknesses. If we don't have a comparable measure, that might mean that we can't engage in cross-cultural analyses. And what are the implications for that in terms of interventions, implementation, et cetera? So just to wrap us up, so we have a little bit of time for discussion, There are many lessons learned out there for using CBPR to develop surveys. Clearly having options for how people participate in this process is going to be important. Some of this work was done many years ago before we knew how virtual our lives and worlds would become. But just thinking about geographical distance and differences between people's geographical settings, um, can have a lot to do with the ability to participate and participate in different ways. I talked earlier about the importance of having structures for participation that also need to be flexible, and we need to make very good use of people's time. So, I'm not a fan of meetings just to meet, and I'm sure that we don't want to have our communities, our community members, our community constituents attend meetings where maybe their participation isn't as needed at that time as it might be at another time. So being really clear and establishing together when participation is needed from whom. The issue, of course, of balancing multiple priorities is essential through this process because our priorities as researchers are likely going to be very, very different than our community partners' priorities. And how do we adapt and accommodate those different priorities? We want to ensure that the contributions of our community partners are being valued. And there's quite a bit that's been written about what forms that might take, obviously compensating people, compensating organizations, but there are many other ways in which we can value community contributions to this effort. And as I mentioned at the beginning, um, really figuring out if there are ways and processes and kind of deliverables that can help to sustain mutual commitment to a more community engaged process. We also really want to be reflexive about this work. We want to continually examine the partnership that we've established and the processes that we've established. I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. And communicate directly, often, early, consistently, respectfully. And as you've seen before, really focus on building capacity of partners and partnership. So where I wanted to just wrap us up is, a big part of this has been around developing surveys through a community-based participatory approach. But I think as you read in our Milbank Quarterly paper, we have done a lot of work to figure out how to assess the engagement process. So there's the process of engaging to develop the surveys, and then there's sort of that meta level of assessing how is that process going of engaging people and communities in these processes. And so I wanted to share some resources with you. There is a measure which I have not actually been able to get my hands on, the Partnership Assessment in Community-Based Research, or PAIR. This was an initial development paper, and I haven't actually seen later work, but if you are familiar with it, I would love to get it. I actually found for today this website, Community Engaged Research, and there is a wealth of information there about different measures, papers that describe measures. I could have spent a lot more time with it. I found it not long before our session today. My colleague and I did a cyber seminar on measuring processes and impacts of veteran engaged research, but I don't think there's a whole lot in it that wouldn't be relevant even if you're not engaging veterans specifically. And there's a toolkit for veteran engagement that is freely available, that we are really proud of, and that I think has a lot to offer in terms of community engagement. Again, it's focused on engagement in VA for veterans, but there's a lot in it that is not specific to VA or veterans. And then I think you're familiar with our Milbank paper. And so I'm going to end there. I did want to mention that last night I was having dinner with some friends, and I mentioned that I was going to do this talk, and one of my friends, Sarah Ono, who's a fellow anthropologist, mentioned that there is a really interesting resource from the Oregon Health Authority, looking at measurement in relation to equity and inclusion. and I haven't really had a chance to dig into it much, but it has a lot to do with the design of items, measures, etc., for measuring different aspects of identity, and which is, very tricky, as we all know. And there is a tremendous amount of thought that's gone into this set of resources. So I barely scratched the surface, and I can't speak to it with a lot of knowledge because I just haven't had a chance to check it out. But I wanted to share it with you because if that's one of the things that you're interested in, it might be a really nice example of how they went about thinking through measurement issues and engaging community in the process of designing measures and surveys that are identity related. So thank you so much for listening. And now I would be really happy to hear questions, thoughts, comments, critiques, anything you want to throw my way.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Jesse. Thank you so much for this talk. After this, we're going to be going through our projects, and this is basically exactly what I need. So
Oh, good. I'm so
and
glad.
every single one of your references here, so I appreciate it. One of my questions is about the steering committee, and how you form the steering committee, or like who's on those steering committees, and how is that different from the focus group makeup? Basically, the project that I'm doing has, yes, I'm calling them panels now, but essentially focus groups that are going to be giving some stakeholder informed contributions to my project. And so trying to make the decisions between like tiebreakers and those types of things. Right now, I'm just thinking it'd be me and my mentors, but it's really interesting that you have the steering committees. I'd love to hear who would be on those type of committees and how you put them together.
Yeah, I think it's such a great question. People may have different perspectives than mine. I acknowledge that. I tend to be a bit of a old school, like purist when it comes to focus groups. So let me just put that out there to begin with. So I have had the most success, and also witnessed more success in steering committees, expert panels, um, that type of organizations, of group of people when they are multi-level. So when you have people from multiple levels of the organization, but that everyone, once they're a steering committee member, they're at the same level of input, authority, expertise, sort of, as Lisa Rubenstein, who many of you may know, always used to talk about, where there, it's a level playing field. So even though in other circumstances or contexts, it may be seen that some people are at a higher level of power or authority than others in that particular group. Once you're in that group, everyone has the same say, everyone has the same type and level of input. If you're in a voting process, everyone's vote counts the same. It's not to say, well, the person with lived experience who's in that on that committee has less authority or power or less of a vote than someone who is in, who's the chief medical officer. Everyone has the same vote. So I think that when we're trying to do this difficult work, we want to have people from as many levels of the community, the organization, the institution, et cetera, as possible, so that we really have that diversity of perspectives. Whereas with focus groups, I would not recommend that. So that's why I say, like, my perspective being, having been, a qualitative methods person for a very long time, is that we don't really want to mix people at different levels of power and authority in our focus groups. So we want to have groups of people at similar levels in each focus group. Because, what we're trying to elicit in focus groups are people's, honest, hopefully as unvarnished as they may be comfortable sharing, perspectives and opinions on things. And if they feel that, this is not to say that can't happen in a steering committee, a lot has to happen to establish that level playing field. But in focus groups, that might be a one-time thing. People who are at a different level of authority or power just may not feel as comfortable and willing to share their perspectives if they feel like there are others with more power who should go first or should have more time to talk or whose opinions matter more, that type of thing. So I'm not a fan personally of focus groups that mix people who are otherwise in different levels of the organization with different levels of power and authority. Whereas in expert panels, that can be incredibly valuable. And, you don't want to have only one level of a perspective in an expert panel. You really want to have many, many different perspectives being brought to that expert panel process. Now, that being said, it's a lot of the work is in the analysis of your focus groups where, yes, you're getting these different perspectives, but you're sort of getting these different consolidations of those perspectives and then triangulating them in your analysis so you can, clearly say, here's what people with lived experience said about this. Here's what administrators said about this. Here's what physicians said about it. Here's what nurses said or peers, whatever it might be. So you do want to bring those together. And that can be really valuable for the expert panel, and the expert panel or steering committee can even weigh in on what those focus groups look like. But I would approach them differently so that when you're gathering data in a focus group, you're really gathering it from people who have a very, sort of specific and strategic shared interest and type of experience. Not that they're going to have the same perspective, but they're coming at that data collection data collection effort or episode, knowing, oh, I'm the same as everyone in the room in these key ways. I've had such and such diagnosis, or I've gotten care at such and such setting, or we're all primary care providers, or we're all administrators of such and such organizations. So there needs to be a different composition from my perspective in the two types of gatherings, let's say.
Thank you.
Of course, thank you. And if my links in the PDF are not available, I can just send the PowerPoint. It's no problem. I was hoping they'd still be active, but if they're not, I can just send them.
Yeah, and we'll circulate that after the meeting, circulate the slides. It's a PDF to everybody.
Okay, great. Benjamin.
Thank you for such a great presentation. I guess my question is for you laid out what could be a very detailed and resource intensive process. And I'm thinking, especially for those of us who are kind of starting out and have limited resources, how do you think about dividing things up and breaking them down into potentially easier to manage or easier to fund components?
Right. Yeah, great question. I mean, I think with, some of those adaptation processes, those are like very expensive and very well funded and very large scale. And that's not where we start out with doing this type of work. I tend to be very pragmatic, and I think if I'm doing like a pilot study, I don't want to have so many measures that where I have questions about the relevance and appropriateness of those measures. So I would probably lean toward a smaller set of measures, hopefully where some work has already been done to adapt them or tailor them to the communities that I'm interested in. Or you could at least do some preliminary work to even that cognitive testing with a couple of people, just to say, here are the three measures I'm thinking of using. What do you think? And get their feedback on those measures. So you can start at a much smaller scale. I've done a lot of work in substance use treatment, and I was using, for anyone who does that type of work, you might be familiar with the risk assessment battery. And it asks a lot of questions about different drug using activities and practices. And I was mostly doing qualitative work with my participants, but I also wanted to have this measure. And, you know, probably a survey person would be very horrified, but when I started to ask the questions, which were very much like closed-ended, do you do this? Yes or no? Have you done this? Yes or no? But the minute someone started answering and they elaborated on their yes or no, I let them elaborate. And because I really wanted to hear what they had to say. And it provided so much more context. Like the one thing that I'm thinking about is like I was asking if one of the questions is around like needle sharing practices, and then someone's answer was, well, I can't really give you a yes or no because sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. Depends on who I'm with and what I know about them and if we've shared needles before, et cetera, et cetera. And so I just thought, being more of a qualitative person, that was going to be more important for me to understand more of that contextual information about these behaviors for this person than having a yes or no. I mean, it was a decision on my part not to administer the survey exactly as it was designed. And again, some might feel that that is a very, very bad thing to do. Of course, I explained why I did it and provided my rationale, and I backed up the decision to do it that way. But it's another approach even that can happen in cognitive testing where you do allow people to elaborate because you want to not only know if the question makes sense to them, but if their ways of being able to answer it make sense to them. This was clearly not for this group of people I was interviewing. Yes, no options they just didn't make sense. And so I could have gotten yeses and nos to those items, but I wouldn't have really been able to interpret them properly or appropriately. So I went in a different direction with it. I'm not saying that's what everyone should go and do. I don't want to get in trouble for saying that. But really think about, maybe a more limited set of measures, maybe where there is information available about any cognitive or pre-testing that's been done with them, any tailoring or adapting that's been done with them. And if you do have to go to the extent of translation, there are processes that would really need to be followed. But again, you're not going to want to do that with 10 or 15 measures. So, because it's just going to be too expensive and not feasible. So that's why I'd keep it pretty narrowly focused in the beginning, just to see, is this the right set of measures? What do I know about these measures? How accurate do I think they are to the community where I want to do this work? And then can I use some of these processes that we've talked about to ensure or do a little bit more to ensure that they are in fact appropriate and getting at what I'm interested in this particular community. So very pragmatic, in other words.
Thank you.
Of course. Brandon, I'm looking at your point in the chat. Yes. Yes. I agree. I agree. And we have been talking about that a lot in different spaces. I feel like that's coming up, this issue of, community engaged work getting as much attention and kind of praise and recognition and acknowledgement in all the ways that we seek that in academia, as other forms of work that do not involve community engagement and the long and devoted and committed attention that such work takes. It's been coming up a lot in implementation science circles for me. I think it's certainly changed since I was doing this work a long time ago, and many people who we stand on the shoulders of in this group, or whose shoulders are here in this group, have really paved the way for that. Thinking about, Ken Wells and many others who have really shown the value and the importance of doing work in this way. I think there's still a long way to go. Because this work doesn't tend to get published in the highest impact journals, still harder to fund. Like you said, it takes longer to, establish these relationships in order to do this type of work. We don't often get the funding we need to take that time. But there are a growing number of mechanisms that actually give us the opportunity to do that, like PCORI mechanisms and other mechanisms where there's more time built in for the engagement work to happen, or there's like a pre-project engagement type of funding that we can get to do more of this work. So I think it's changing slowly. But maybe if we're all doing it, it will change a little bit more rapidly than it has been over the past couple of decades. So I know we're at the end of our time together, and I see Gerald put in the evaluation. So, definitely feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions. Thank you so much for bringing me to your monthly seminar to talk about this. I think it is such an important topic, and I'm very excited at the thought that many of you are going to be tackling it in your own work. The one resource that I did want to share in case you're interested in it, and I happen to have it right here, which is a YouTube playlist with a lot of workshops. They're all implementation science related, but a lot of workshops, qualitative methods workshops, and other workshops in the implementation science space. So there might be, and we've done some sessions on engagement. So they're all freely available for you should anything in that resource be of interest to you. So thank you so much. Anything that and the organizers want to share before we wrap up?
Yes, so please complete the survey, and let me pull up the next schedule. Well,
yeah, and we'll have all these resources in an email to everybody
Right.
after the talk. Thanks so much, Dr. Hamilton. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure.